nice to have you here, and it's very nice to have you this conversation with you on Nord Stream 2. The first question we would have is, how do you think that the recent escalation in Ukraine would impact the Nord Stream 2? What's the link in between these two things?
Yes, well, the first thing to say is I think there's a general deterioration in EU-Russia relations, for which, of course, the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the conflict in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, have been an extremely destabilizing element. That was always going to create a security conundrum that would last years. Not an easy one to solve. And the immediate context is, of course, a Russian military buildup along the eastern borders of Ukraine. That has triggered fears in the West, in the EU and in NATO, in the US, of course, as well, claiming to have indications and military intelligence that suggests that what Russia is doing east of the Ukrainian border is essentially preparing some kind of military intervention in Ukraine. This is something that the Russian Federation flatly denies. But in the context of a very substantive military buildup with a very volatile and hostile international context, the threat sounds, if not plausible, then quite alarming. The prospect of errors being made and some escalation leading to an open conflict are quite real. So it's a very dangerous situation. Now, in that general context, and in the specific sort of a build-up over the last few weeks of Russian military forces along the Ukrainian border, Nord Stream 2, which is essentially the gasoduct, the pipeline project linking the Russian Federation and Germany, which is sensitive on a number of levels. It bypasses a number of Eastern European countries, and it introduces a spanner in the works of some kind of unified European and American position vis-a-vis Russia in terms of foreign and security policy. Well, Nord Stream 2 has been thrown into the conflict as a potential negotiating tool. Back in spring 2021, Biden had decided to hold sanctions, American sanctions on Nord Stream 2, partly as a gesture to Germany, who in those days, this is before the German federal elections, complained that such sanctions on Nord Stream 2 would be a kind of intervention in its own domestic affairs. Also a sign that, well, slapping sanctions on something as important as Nord Stream 2 is not an easy thing to do, and it has a lot of political and diplomatic costs that the Biden administration was perhaps reluctant to take up immediately. And for a number of other reasons, the Biden administration decided to wait on those sanctions. Pressure now is building partly on the European Union's Eastern members, Central and Eastern members, but also on other members of the international community to ramp up the prospect of sanctions against Nord Stream 2. So we're seeing, again, in the last week, in the last days, calls to bring those sanctions back on Nord Stream 2. And in fact, even in the American political context, Ted Cruz, the Republican politician from Texas, who is currently vetoing a number of Biden's nominations for ambassadors in the Senate, has offered a deal. And the deal would be if the Biden administration can reinstate the sanctions program against Nord Stream 2, then Ted Cruz promises to lift his ban on Biden's ambassadors' nominations. So a lot of things are happening, and Nord Stream is an essential sort of card in the tug and tussle between Europe, the US, and Russia, particularly in this piping context around the military buildup and escalation of rhetoric in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, so a lot of interesting point, and of course you were quoting 2014, which is the year of the start of the Ukrainian crisis, and also the start of a sanction scheme against Russia. And now we're 7 years later, and we're at the brink of a possibly new sanction scheme. So the question is, how central, even though you partially already replied on that, how central would be Nord Stream 2 in this new sanction scheme?
Yeah. So again, every day, the kind of rhetorical pressure is building up, and we're hearing more about the role of Nord Stream 2 in terms of a possible Western response to a potential Russian intervention in Ukraine. Just last night, just this morning, I was hearing different European leaders make the same threats again. The general warning is that if Russia steps over the line in Ukraine, that's the kind of rhetoric employed anyway, that they would face massive sanctions and a massive response, that they would really have to regret having done that. Of course, the threat in itself hasn't been very specific. It hasn't been specified at all. And it's reasonable to expect that what European and US politicians are warning Russia about in the event of a conflict in Ukraine is precisely sanctions on Nord Stream 2. That is presumably the biggest stake in terms of sanctions that the US and the EU could lift against Russia. And that seems to be increasingly what the rhetoric is pointing at. Now, in and of itself, this would be very problematic, both for Russia and for Germany in particular. So there's no clear winners out of this sort of threat should it come to fruition. So we have to see. But much of this is also entangled already with legal and technical issues about giving a kind of procedural green light to the project anyway. So that's a different, if you like, more technical context in which the Nord Stream 2 project is sort of under threat already.
Yeah. I mean, of course, Europeans and Americans are allies, so they stand together on the topic of sanctions, but there is no doubt that when it comes to foreign policy, Europe is more exposed to Russia just because it's our neighborhood. And in particular, in this case, the agreement it's between the pipeline actually is between Russia and Germany. So Germany is also particularly exposed. How do you think the sanctions would impact not just Russia, but Germany and Europe as a whole, if seriously undertaken by Europe and the US?
I think that's a really difficult question because it depends on the time frame that you want to use in thinking about the answer. So in the short run, Russia needs a European market for its gas exports, and Germany is a really essential part of that. And in the context, of course, of different energy shocks and a very sharp rise in electricity prices, partly related to a sharp rise in gas prices, European states and Germany needs the Russian supplies. That's a very sort of local and contemporary, if you like, take on the question. So that Nord Stream 2 isn't yet being commissioned to deliver any gas. I hope we can come to that point a little bit later on. But at some point, the delivery of Russian gas through Nord Stream 2 would have an impact on the German economy. But in general, I think if you take a slightly broader historical perspective, there are conditionants both in the past and in the future. Towards the past, there's been a general German preference for a policy that one might call non-confrontational towards its Russian neighbor or near neighbor. I mean, many authors put this down to more psychological factors, such as, you know, some kind of guilt that Germans might feel for Nazi atrocities during World War II, or some kind of sense of gratitude for the relative easiness with which the Soviet Union allowed the unification of Germany in the early 90s. But in general, there's always been close historical, cultural, and economic ties between Germany and Russia. And I think this is quite relevant. I mean, after 2014, this key year, which we've already mentioned, the annexation of Crimea, a number of sanctions against Russia were lifted. But Russian-German economic ties have still held quite strong, even after sanctions. In fact, German FDI flows into Russia, in particular sectors such as the car industry, but generally chemicals and the pharmaceutical industry and so on. In general, German FDI has increased. It's even increased since 2018. So the current sanctions and difficulties between Germany and Russia, between the European allies and Russia, between the US and Russia and so on, the growing assertiveness of Russia in the international field has not stopped the consolidation of economic ties and business links between Germany and Russia, right? So quite beyond Nord Stream 2, there's a little bit more at stake there in terms of the German economy. What I think is also interesting is the position of the German Business Association with regards to that particular economic vector towards Russia. The idea in the kind of Ostpolitik tradition has always been that, you know, if you can establish reasonable ties with Russia, if you can establish some kind of reliable partnership, also based on economic relations and so on with Russia, then eventually reform, political reform in Russia is something that you can expect. So that, you know, appeasement and not being confrontational against Russia might generate a situation in which Russia comes closer to better standards of governance and so on and so forth. That, I think, seems to have been, well, failing quite visibly over the last few years. The German Business Confederation last April, I believe, published a report beginning to question this sort of very established idea that better relations and economic ties with Russia could eventually lead to some kind of internal reform there for the better. So it's these complications and problems go a little bit beyond Nord Stream.
Yes, I see, and it's very interesting that you quoted Ostpolitik, because of course Germany is geographically located at the heart of Europe, and its history has always been, at least in the 21st century, has been a division in between West and East. And also in this specific case, I would say that Germany exemplifies how Europe's position is in between Russia and the US, and how we're facing challenges in simply because of our geographical position, and of course the values of Europe are closer to the ones of the US, but when it comes to implementing sanctions and that go against Russia's particularly aggressive foreign policy in Ukraine, because of the closeness we have to the countries, it is particularly difficult in Europe when it comes to dealing also with the consequences. When it comes instead to the energy policy in Europe, we're witnessing lately a milestone, I would say, as we've seen the adoption of the EU taxonomy on sustainable development. But of course, there's been some debate also on it, as we've seen the debate on the inclusion of nuclear power, and also the inclusion on fossil gases. And now it looks that the inclusion of fossil gases, it's probable. And I wonder how that particular move might also impact it might impact the Nord Stream 2, but also the reaction of the European Union towards the agreement and the functioning of the pipeline eventually.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I've mentioned past traditions and conditionings that might affect Germany's relationship to Russia. But of course, there are future ones too. And essentially, there's a horizon in, by 2050 at the European level. In Germany, it's by 2045 of achieving some kind of economic stage of development where, these economies are carbon neutral. So as part of that, and part of the European Green New Deal currently being negotiated and formulated, there's this question of the EU's green taxonomy, the EU taxonomy, which is an essential part of the Green New Deal in terms of trying to identify what activities are environmentally sustainable, and which economic activities are acceptable in terms of incoming energy transition towards fossil-free future, but also in terms of energy investment, which energy investment is clean, and to try to give very specific and clear economic and financial guidelines for European investors about where to where to take their money. This is part of, incidentally, not just of the Green New Deal, but of an attempt to stage a recovery from the economic effects of the COVID pandemic, involving a green bond, which the European Union is planning to set 250 billion euros aside for. So it's a big deal whether the European Union decides to class, in particular, natural gas and nuclear energy in this or not, right? Now, over the last few days again, and a lot of things are happening over the last few days, the EU has been making some signals that it might leave nuclear energy and natural gas outside of its green taxonomy. However, the decision is not yet final. The final decision will come apparently on the 22nd of December. So we still have to, wait on the cliffhanger a little bit before we finally get a sense of whether the European Union is really serious about the energy transition to a fossil-free future or not. In any case, the issue is extremely divisive within European politics. The European Union has never quite had any substantive unity in terms of energy policies. This has been very clear in the relationship between the EU and Russia in terms of energy security and other energy matters. And it doesn't have unity on this. There's a group of EU members led especially by France, but including also Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and a few other states that are in favor of including natural gas and nuclear energy in the EU's green taxonomy. And facing that group of EU members is Italy, Spain, Denmark, Austria, and of course, very important, Germany, who think that the EU should leave natural gas and nuclear energy out. And obviously, the implications of this for the EU's energy relations to Russia are huge. They would affect the role of Nord Stream 2, as we've been talking about. But beyond Nord Stream 2, Russia has been trying to secure long-term contracts with its European customers. And should the EU leave nuclear energy and natural gas out of the list of greenest economic activities and areas of economic investment, this would also have important implications there. So there are a number of movements around the European Union's green taxonomy, which are really key, and that we're going to have to wait a few more days to have something more specific to say on. There's also a European Union plan, in any case, under the current sort of gas price and electricity price crisis, to develop strategic natural gas reserves, precisely to front situations like the current one. And again here, the issue on the negotiating table is the ability of Russia to secure long-term contracts. European gas imports are actually more and more done on spot markets, as you'll know, Elena. So this is all, in a sense, in the air.
Yeah, I mean, the worry of some is that if the taxonomy includes certain sources of power, might look like a sort of greenwashing. And I assume that this is the worry also of many supporters of the Green Party in Germany, where currently we have seen the rise of the Greens, and who are also part of the new government. So just touching briefly again on this state, how do you think that the new government and also probably also the new era with without Angela Merkel might change the scenario when it comes to Nord Stream 2?
Well, we're still right at the beginning of the new traffic light coalition in Germany that has just been sworn into office. So it's very early days. But I think there are a number of straws in the air that indicate actually significant tendencies towards change. I've talked a little bit about the historical links between Germany and Russia, and I've talked about the tradition of Ostpolitik and all that. Now, that used to be a strong foreign policy tradition, especially in the German Social Democratic Party, in the SPD. But there's been a generational change in the German Social Democratic Party. And the SPD anyway is now in a government coalition with the Greens, which, as you say, had a very good election in September. And now, on the one hand, that's led to a major concrete change, which is the appointment of the foreign minister. The foreign minister is the co-leader of the German Green Party, Lena Baerbock, whose sort of foreign policy line is very close to Joe Biden's and is notably, well, not more confrontational, but certainly more assertive in terms of the relationship against Russia. Baerbock advocates a unified European response against Russia. It's, she's not in favor of any kind of appeasement. I mean, she's in favor of continuing the dialogue with Russia, but she's not in favor of any kind of appeasement. While the German chancellor has had to be a little bit more cautious in the context of the recent events in the Ukrainian eastern border, Baerbock, again, the German foreign minister, has already said publicly that Nord Stream is something at stake should Russia engage, overstep the line in Ukraine. So her position is quite clear in terms of what Germany's relation to Russia should be. And in fact, very recently, I believe last week, on Wednesday, in fact, a couple of Russian diplomats were expelled from Germany, and the Russian ambassador was called to consultation by the German state, because a German court had found that there had been a political killing at the behest of Moscow in Berlin back in 2019. And so what seems to be already changing notably is the fact that the new German coalition in power has a foreign minister that takes a much clearer and assertive line in terms of Germany's relation to Russia. Beyond that, I think the Green Party is quite interested, evidently, in Russia's own transition to a fossil-free economy. And the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, the kind of think tank for the German Green Party, has been very vocal about the fact that the Russian Federation pays some lip service to, addressing climate change, et cetera, but that it doesn't really do anything serious about it. So I think that the German Green Party is, sees a more assertive policy towards Russia as, in a way, also a lever to consolidate some kind of clearer energy transition in a very hydrocarbon-based economy like the Russian one. So I think we're seeing very important changes in that relationship. And I think the German elections are already giving clear indications of that. We'll just have to wait and see how these and the next set of crises, leave the pieces. But there seems to be indications of change.
Yes, definitely. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how this relationship develops in 2022. And in terms of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, you said before that you would like to touch upon its functioning. So I think we should also talk about a more legal aspect. So technically speaking, the pipeline respects all of the European requirements, but there's also a competition side to it. So when it comes to competition, the pipeline is owned by Gazprom, and then the gas that is supposed to flow in it is also by Gazprom, and this creates legally this would create a precedent for Europe. How do you think that this would play out, and also how do you think that maybe these legal matters would be used to prolong the timing when it comes to functioning of the pipeline, because of course there's this issue with Gazprom?
Well, the general question is, could legal issues delay the commission of Russian gas through Gazprom, through Nord Stream 2? And is that process sort of threatened from a procedural and technical legal standpoint? Now, they've already answered this question for us. Just last night, the Bundesnetzagentur, the German energy regulator, suspended any further decisions on Nord Stream 2 until the summer of 2022. So it won't take any decisions about giving the green light to Nord Stream 2 or not until next July. So it's already imposed, in a sense, a moratorium while it waits for more documents from this Nord Stream 2 AG company, which is based in Switzerland. And apart from the issue of bundling and having separate suppliers to the providers of gas, as you've mentioned, also seems to need to clear another hurdle, which is to set up a different subsidiary company and register it in Germany. And until all those processes are done, it seems, nothing will move. So de facto, Nord Stream is on the hold, also on legal and technical questions, and not just on political ones. So there's an interesting conflict, therefore, between political considerations and the fact that the current German foreign minister, Elena has already indicated that Nord Stream could certainly be something that would be on the table should Russia not act properly in Ukraine according to German standards. And also the energy regulator in Germany has already decided that so far Nord Stream 2 does not clear all the legal hurdles. So is important. The German foreign minister has also indicated that that at any rate, there is the issue of EU law that needs to be clear here, and she's expressed doubts that the Nord Stream 2 project clears all those hurdles. So legal and technical aspects are certainly already in holding back the full functioning of Nord Stream 2, to the great chagrin of Russian officials and politicians. And what is going to be very interesting to look at over the next weeks and months is the extent to which there is in any way any political influence on the legal decisions, to the extent to which both these lines of decision on whether Nord Stream 2 can go ahead or not overlap or stay independent. Because of course, part of the German political debate, those who are not so against closer ties with Russia, and of course Russian officials, constantly insist that Nord Stream 2 should be left out of diplomatic rows, geopolitical crises, etc., that this is a different kind of issue and should not be mixed up with events in Ukraine or events in general that complicate the EU-Russia or US-Russia relation. So we will have to see and look very, very attentively at that. It's a very interesting process, but there's been a convergence between the kind of political signals coming out of Berlin in terms of putting Nord Stream 2 on hold, and the more technical legal aspects saying that Nord Stream 2 AG cannot yet be considered to have cleared all legal and technical hurdles.
Yeah, definitely. We see an overlap, of course, of legal issues, but also political issues, and we've covered also the economic aspects of this agreement. And it's also very interesting to see how, of course, political issues are just internationally strive from internal politics. So I'm really glad that today we were able to cover all of these different parts of the conversation, and it was just very nice to have this chat with you.
Grazie, Elena. Piacere.
Thank you very much, and thank you again. Have a nice day. Bye.